There is a lake somewhere in the dark tonight, and its surface is moving. Wind comes across the reeds. The water shifts, breaks the moonlight into 100 smaller lights, none of them still. And yet below all of it, the water does not move. It has not moved in a very long time. You know this feeling on the inside. The thought that arrives just as the body begins to soften. The thing you carried all day that you have not yet found a place to put down. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep alone does not cure. Tonight is for that. If you want to leave one word in the comments, just one, for what has been moving in you today, I would be glad to see it. I want to be honest with you. I came to these stories because of something I noticed one evening with a cup of tea that had gone cold, sitting in a quiet room, not thinking about anything in particular, and for one small moment I felt it. Something underneath. Still, not because I had made it still, but because stillness is simply what it is, below everything. I have been looking for that in stories ever since. Tonight, we travel to the villages and valleys of Sri Lanka, China, Tibet, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and Burma, following ordinary people across 12 centuries. A weaver, a farmer, a widow at a riverside, a cook, a potter, a tea picker, a fisherman, each one touching the same quiet thing from a different direction. These stories are contemplative in nature and are not a substitute for medical or therapeutic care. Find what is most comfortable. Let the weight of your body be fully held. Let your eyes close, or soften, or go wherever they want to go. Whatever has been moving on the surface tonight, something underneath has not moved at all. It is already there. The temple bells at Anuradhapura rang before the sun came up, and Nandini was already at her loom. She had been a weaver for 31 years, since the age of 12, when her mother first placed the shuttle in her hands and showed her how to feel the tension in the thread before she threw it, how to listen for the small resistance that told you the warp was true. Her mother had learned from her mother, and that woman from hers, and none of them had spoken much about the work. They simply sat down before the loom each morning and began. The knowledge passed not through instruction, but through proximity, the way warmth passes between two people sitting close in a cold room, without either of them arranging for it to happen. The bells came from the direction of the Mahavihara, the great monastery to the north of the city, and they traveled across the rooftops and the coconut palms and the open ground between the monastery and the weaving quarter, and by the time they reached Nandini's small house, they had softened into something that was less a sound than a texture in the air, something you felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. She had heard them every morning of her adult life. She did not think about them the way she thought about other sounds. They were simply part of the morning, the way the coolness on the earthen floor was part of the morning, and the smell of night-blooming jasmine fading from the yard outside, and the first creak of the loom as she settled onto the low wooden bench and took the shuttle into her right hand. The bench was made of old wood that her husband Sudha had shaped before he died, 12 years ago now, of a fever that came and was gone in a week. The wood had darkened with use and with the oil of her hands resting against it over 12 years of mornings, and it had the specific smoothness of a thing that has been touched a great many times by the same hands. A smoothness that is not the smoothness of newness, but of long acquaintance, of something worn past its surface into a kind of honesty. She sat down on the bench the way she sat down every morning, without thinking about it, and the weight of her settled into it the way water settles into its container, finding its level without instruction. The loom was in front of her. It was a simple loom of the kind that women in the weaving quarter had used for generations, low-framed and wide, made for sitting close to the work. The warp threads were already strung from the week before. 140 threads counted out by hand on an evening when she had nothing else to do, and they hung now in the morning light like rain before it falls, vertical and waiting. The light at this hour came through a single gap high in the eastern wall, a gap that Suda had made deliberately when he built the room, because he had watched his mother weave and knew that a weaver needed to see the thread true before the day had begun, to flatten everything into its ordinary brightness. The light that came through that gap in the early morning was not yet sunlight. It was something before sunlight, a pale grey luminescence that had no heat in it and fell across the warp threads like quiet water, showing their individual thicknesses, their slight irregularities, the places where one thread held tighter than its neighbor. It was the most honest light of the day. Everything looked like itself in that light. Outside, a bird she had never learned the name of made 3 notes and stopped. The question that had been sitting in her chest for 5 days was this: the ivory thread she had ordered from a merchant in the eastern quarter had not arrived, and the robe cloth for the Mahavihara's rains retreat offering was due in 2 days. 3 weeks before, a boy had come to her door with a message from the head monk, the Venerable Kassapa, a man she had known since he was a young bhikkhu, newly arrived from the mainland, serious in the way of young monks who have not yet learned which of their seriousness matters and which does not. He had grown into an old man of great stillness, the kind that does not come from having resolved all uncertainty, but from having spent a very long time in its presence without being undone by it. His request was simple: a robe cloth for the rain's retreat offering, long enough to wrap twice around a tall man, woven fine, ivory if she could manage it. She had accepted because she always accepted commissions from the Mahavihara, and because the ivory thread was not difficult to obtain from the Eastern Quarter merchant, who kept it specifically for work like this, and because 3 weeks was enough time if she started within the week and kept her usual hours. She had sent word to the merchant the same afternoon. The merchant had sent word back that the thread was coming from the coast, from a supplier he had used for many years, and would arrive within the week. A second message came 7 days later, written in the cramped hand of the merchant's son: a delay with the boat. He was sorry. The thread would arrive soon. It had not arrived soon. And then a week passed, and the thread had not arrived at all. And now it was the morning of the 5th day before the offering, and Nandini had been sitting with this fact in her chest since before the bells rang. The way you sit with something you have picked up without meaning to and now do not quite know how to put down, because the putting down does not seem to be available, and carrying it has become such a constant sensation that you have almost stopped noticing you are carrying it, though your body knows. She wound the dark thread she had onto the shuttle. It was the color of river water after the rains, a grey-brown that was not what she had planned, not what the Venerable Kassapa had requested, and she told herself she would use it only to keep her hands occupied while she waited, because a weaver who sits without weaving is a weaver whose hands begin to forget what they are for, and forgetting was something she did not have time for this week. She threw the shuttle. The thread moved through the warp the way it always moved, and the loom made the sound it always made, a low rhythmic knock and slide that had been the ground note of her mornings for 31 years, steady and unremarkable. the sound of cloth being made one line at a time. And the morning was the same as every other morning except for the weight in her chest, which was still there, present and without resolution. But a loom does not know about the weight in a weaver's chest. A loom knows about tension and release, about the thread going one way and the beater coming down and the thread going the other way, about the cloth growing one line at a time below the bar, about the relationship between what is held and what moves, which is the only relationship a loom has ever been interested in. And so Nandini's hands did what her hands knew how to do, and the shuttle went back and forth. And the morning moved around her the way mornings had moved around her for 3 decades, regardless of what she was carrying inside it. Her second daughter came in from the yard with water and set it beside the loom without speaking. The girl was 11. She had learned, without being taught, not to talk to her mother before the loom had been going for at least an hour. She understood something about the work that Nandini had never put into words, which was that the first hour was not for talking. It was for something that had no name. Only the quality that, when it was finished, the day was different from when it had not yet happened. The girl set the water down gently and went back outside, and Nandini heard her bare feet on the earth of the yard, and then nothing but the loom. The shuttle went back and forth. The cloth grew, one line at a time, in the color of rain-gray river water. And at some point, without Nandini deciding to, the weight in her chest became quiet. She could not have said when it happened, the way you cannot say when you passed from waking into sleep. One moment, the weight was there, and then the loom was asking for something that left no room for carrying anything else alongside it. And her hands were in the work, and the work was the entirety of what was happening, and the weight had simply stopped being the largest thing in the room. Not because it had been resolved, not because the thread had arrived, only because the work had asked for all of her, and she had given all of her to it. And in the giving there was no part left over to stand outside and worry. She had noticed this before, over 31 years. The loom did not solve problems, but the loom reliably put her in a place where problems could not reach the deepest part of her. That part was occupied. That part was in the work, and the work did not have problems. The work only had the next throw of the shuttle. The sun had come fully through the wall gap and was laying a long bar of warm light across the cloth when the merchant's boy appeared in the doorway with a wrapped bundle under his arm. The ivory thread. Late, but here. Nandini looked at the bundle. She looked at the cloth on her loom. 1/4 finished now. The grey-brown of rain river water. The bar of morning light moving across it and finding every thread, showing the work honestly in the way that morning light does, without flattery, without concealment. What it was showing her now was something she had not expected to see when she began this cloth with the wrong thread. Using what was in her hands, because her hands could not simply be still. She said, "Take it back." The boy blinked. He was perhaps 14, with dust on his sandals and the expression of someone entirely unprepared to return what he had been sent to deliver. He said, "But you ordered it." She said, "I know. I will pay for the order. Take it back to the merchant. I will not use the thread." He stood a moment, looking at the cloth on the loom, then at the bundle, then at Nandini, who had already turned back to the shuttle. After a moment, he left quietly, the way people leave rooms where someone is in the middle of something they have not chosen to stop. Nandini did not watch him go. She was looking at the cloth in the morning light, and what she was seeing was this. The grey-brown cloth was not what she had intended, but in the light, It was not a compromise either. It was the color of the island at the beginning of the rains, when the sky lowers and the earth softens and everything turns the color of patience itself, of waiting without resistance. A monk sitting beneath this cloth during the rain's retreat would be wearing the color of the very thing the retreat was for. She had not planned this. She had only kept weaving with what was in her hands. It took 2 more days to finish. She wove at her usual pace, in her usual hours. When the cloth was done, she folded it carefully and carried it to the Mahavihara in her market basket. Walking the road in the early evening, when the heat had left the stones and the cook fires were beginning in the houses along the way, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and the particular sweetness of the island in the hour before dark, the venerable Kassapa received her in the outer hall. He was old now, and he sat the way very old monks sit, completely and without reminder, as though sitting were not something you did, but something you were. He took the cloth from the basket and held it in both hands for a long time without speaking. In the low light of the hall, the cloth was the color of deep water, of the hour before dawn, of all the colors that are neither this nor that, and are more honest than either. Then he said, "How did you know to make it this color?" Nandini said, "I did not know. The ivory thread was late. I used what I had." He said, "And when the ivory arrived, you sent it back?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said, "What made you do that?" She thought about it honestly. Then she said, "When I saw the cloth in the morning light, I understood that I had not made it. It had come from the weaving itself. The ivory would have been a cloth I decided on beforehand. This cloth had already been decided, somewhere I could not see. I only had to finish it." The venerable Kassapa was quiet for what felt like a long time. When he spoke, his voice had in it the quality of someone who has been looking for a particular word for many years and has just heard it said by someone who did not know they were saying anything important. He said, "That is what we have been trying to say in this monastery for 200 years. Nandini said, "I am sorry. I do not understand what you mean." He said, "I know. That is exactly why I said it." She walked home in the early dark, with the empty basket over her arm, the road familiar under her feet, the bats beginning in the trees above the path, the evening star appearing in the gap between 2 rooftops. She turned the old monk's words in her mind the way she turned cloth to see the weave from a different angle. She was not sure she understood, but something in the exchange had settled in a place below understanding, in the same place where the loom sound lived, which was also the place her daughter had once described, the place that was already quiet before the day began. The robe cloth hung in the Mahavihara for many years. People who sat beneath it during the rain's retreat said that its color was exactly the color of the season. They also said that there was something about sitting beneath it that was different from sitting beneath other cloth, though none of them could say what the difference was or where it came from. When Nandini heard this, years later, she only nodded and went home and sat down at her loom. The shuttle moved through the warp. The morning arrived and became itself, and below the sound of the loom, below the bells from the great monastery, below everything the morning was doing on the surface of things, something continued that had never been interrupted. Not by the missing thread, not by 5 days of carrying what could not yet be resolved, not by the weight that had sat in her chest and then, on an ordinary morning, without ceremony or announcement, simply loosened. You have carried something today. Not a missing thread, perhaps, but something with that same quality of having no solution yet. Something you picked up and could not find a place to set down. You know the feeling of the chest holding it. You know the weight of continuing anyway, of doing what your hands know how to do while the other thing sits in you and waits. Let something soften in the jaw now, or the shoulders. You have been holding more than you know. You have done this before, more times than you can count. You have sat down at your own loom and picked up your own shuttle and let the work do what the work does. And somewhere in the middle of that, the weight became a little lighter without your asking it to. Not because it had been resolved, only because the part of you that was fully in the work had no room left for carrying it. And in that fullness, something that had been pressing simply stopped pressing for a while. There is a part of you that the weight cannot reach. The loom knows where it is. The hands know where it is when they have been in the work long enough. It is not something you have to find. It is not something you have to earn by worrying less or by carrying the weight with more grace. It is simply there, the way the floor of the lake is there, whether the surface is moving or not. And tonight, as the breath moves back and forth through the body, the way the shuttle moves through the warp, back and forth, one line at a time, you can feel the edge of it, the place where the noise of the day stops and something else begins, something that has been here all along, waiting without impatience. Let the breath be slow. Let the body go completely into what is holding it. There is nothing more tonight that needs to be woven. Something below all of this has not moved through any of it. It is where you already are, underneath the surface, underneath the carrying, underneath the weight that has been real and will still be there tomorrow, but which does not reach all the way down to where you actually live. Let the last thought drift to the edge of whatever room you are in and rest there, finished with being carried. And somewhere a little further east, across an ocean and a long reach of land, in a valley where the mornings come slowly and the mist stays low in the rice fields well past the first hour of light, an old farmer is lifting a wooden bucket from a well he has drawn from for 40 years. He is about to set out along the path to the monastery with the morning offering, the same path he has walked since he was a young man. And he has just noticed something about the water in the bucket that he has looked at 10,000 times before this morning and never quite seen until now. The mist had not yet lifted from the rice fields when Wen Bahai left his house with the wooden bucket. He was 63 years old, and he had been making this walk for 40 years. Since the morning after he first moved to the valley as a young man with a new wife and 2 carrying baskets and nothing else of significance. The path was packed earth, worn smooth by his feet and by the feet of those who had walked it before him, running along the edge of the lower field and then rising gently through a stand of old pine trees before it leveled off at the river. In the early morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge to the east, the mist settled into the low places of the valley, and the path moved through it the way a boat moves through shallow water, parting what it passed through, leaving the mist to close again behind each step. The sound of the valley at this hour was mostly silence with things inside it. The rice fields on either side of the path made no sound at all. The pines made a low sound when the wind passed through them, a roughness in the quiet rather than a break in it, like something breathing slowly in a dark room. Somewhere beyond the far ridge, a rooster was announcing the morning to an audience that did not need the announcement. And from the monastery at the far end of the valley, barely audible in the cold, still air, the monks were beginning their morning chant, a low and steady sound like water moving underground, patient and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone was close enough to hear it. Wen Bohai had heard all of this 10,000 times. He did not listen to it the way you listen to something you are trying to hear. He walked through it the way you walk through weather, the feet finding the familiar path without being asked, the body moving through the morning the way the morning moved through the valley, without hurry, without needing to arrive before it arrived. The bucket was old. He had made it himself 40 years ago from wood he split behind the house in the first autumn in the valley. In those early weeks, when he was still turning 4 walls and a roof into something that could hold a life. He had made 2, thinking he would need 2, and one had rotted and been replaced twice. But this one had held. It had darkened with water and use, and with all the mornings that had passed through it. The way a face darkens with the decades it has lived through, not with damage, but with depth. In 2 places the staves had begun to separate and been rebound with fresh withies, and from one of those places the bucket leaked a very small amount, a slow weep of water that ran down the outside and dripped from the bottom at perhaps 1 drop every 20 steps. He had stopped noticing this so long ago he could not have said when he stopped. It was simply part of what the bucket did. The way the morning mist was simply part of what the valley did. You did not stop to question what had always been true. He was not thinking about the bucket this morning. He was not thinking about much at all. He was walking the way he walked every morning, putting one foot before the other and letting the path be the path. And the mist was around his knees in the lower parts of the walk, and the pines were above him in the higher parts, and the monks were chanting somewhere at the end of the valley, low and steady, and his mind was in the state it most often arrived at on this walk, a state that was not quite thought and not quite the absence of thought, but something between them, like water that has settled after being poured and has not yet been asked to go anywhere. The thing that would stay with him for the rest of his life began, as many important things do, with something entirely ordinary. He reached the spring, a place where the water came up through the rock at the base of the hill in a thin, bright thread, and collected in a natural basin no wider than his arm span, cold and clear in every season. The water, always the same temperature, regardless of the weather above ground, because it came from somewhere deep enough that the seasons did not reach it. He crouched and held the bucket under the thread of water and waited for it to fill. The sound the water made going into the bucket changed as the bucket filled, dropping in pitch the way a voice drops when it has finished saying what it needed to say. He lifted the full bucket, stood slowly, the way a man of 63 stands after crouching, and set off back up the path toward the monastery. He had gone perhaps 20 steps when he noticed the water. Not the way you notice something new, the way you suddenly see something you have been looking at for 40 years without actually seeing it. The way a person can live in a house for decades and one morning, for no reason they can name, notice the shape of a familiar window as though for the first time, the way the light comes through it at this hour, and think I have been standing in this light my whole life, and I never saw it until just now. The water in the bucket was moving. Of course it was moving. He was walking, and walking disturbs water in a bucket. The surface sloshed gently with the rhythm of his steps, small waves going back and forth, ordinary and expected and entirely unremarkable, the way it had looked every morning for 40 years. But below the surface, the water was still. He could see it clearly now that he was actually looking at it, the way you see the bottom of a shallow river once you stop attending to the reflections on the surface and let your eyes find their way down through the water itself. The surface did whatever the surface did, and below it, the water simply continued being water, carrying no record of the motion above it, holding no agitation in its depth, going wherever the bucket went, while remaining, in every way that mattered, entirely itself. When Bohai stopped walking, he stood on the path and looked at the water in the bucket for a long time. A sparrow landed on a nearby pine branch and examined him with sideways interest and flew away again. The mist moved through the valley below the path. The monks continued their chant, distant and undisturbed. He was not thinking about what the water meant. He was only looking at it, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone seeing something that has always been there and that they are finally, for whatever reason, ready to see. His wife said later, when he tried to describe this moment to her over their evening meal, that he kept stopping in the middle of sentences and turning his hands over in his lap, as though looking for the words among his own fingers. She said, "You are trying to say something that does not want to be said." He said yes. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "Then say the smallest thing." He said, "I looked down." She waited. He said, "I saw that below the moving." Nothing was moving. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have been walking that path for 40 years. He said, "I know." He was still standing on the path when the young monk Cheng Huai came around the bend looking for him. Because Wen Bohai was late and the morning water had not arrived and the monks were waiting. Cheng Hui was 22 years old, the fourth son of a farming family in Sichuan, sent to the Hongzhou monastery because he had shown from early childhood a natural inclination towards sitting quietly that made him unsuited for field work. He had been at the monastery for 3 years. He studied hard. He sat in meditation every morning and every evening. He listened carefully to everything the senior monk said, and he had not yet understood what he was doing when he sat, or what the studying was for, or why being quiet was supposed to change anything, which was a fact that troubled him considerably, and that he brought to the senior monk every few weeks in slightly different forms. The senior monk told him each time to keep sitting and stop worrying about understanding. Cheng Huai kept sitting. The worry continued, regular and unchanged, like the small leak in the bucket. He came around the bend in the path and found the old farmer standing completely still, holding the bucket in both hands, looking into it with the expression of someone who has just been shown something they were not expecting. "Cheng Huai," said old Wen, "are you all right?" Wen Bohai looked up. He said, "Come here and look at this water." Cheng Hui came and looked. He saw water in a bucket, the surface nearly settled. He said, "I see water." Wen Bohai said, "Look lower than the surface." Cheng Hui looked lower. After a moment he said, "It is still at the bottom." Wen Bohai said, "It is always still. I have been carrying this water for 40 years, and I only saw it this morning." Cheng Hui looked at the water a moment longer, and then at the old farmer, and then back at the water. He said, "What did you understand when you saw it?" Wen Bohai said nothing. "That is what I am trying to tell you. I did not understand anything at all. I only saw the water." They walked back to the monastery together without speaking further. Cheng Hui took the bucket for part of the walk because the old man seemed tired, and he felt the small weep of water from the seam running cool over his hand and dripping from his fingers at regular intervals, 1 drop every 20 steps, the way a clock marks time, steady and unhurried and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone is paying attention to it. He thought about the bucket during the morning meal, turning the image of the still water over in his mind while he ate, trying to find the place where the image connected to the thing he had been sitting with for 3 years. He thought about it during the first meditation period, watching his thoughts move back and forth across the surface of his mind, the way water moves across the surface of a bucket when someone is walking and trying to find the bottom of his mind, and not finding it, which was the same result he arrived at every morning. And then, at some point, during the afternoon sweeping of the courtyard, something happened that had not happened before. The broom was in his hands, and the dust was rising in the pale winter light on the flagstones, and the rhythm of the sweeping was the rhythm of the sweeping, and there was nothing else happening. And Cheng Hui's attention went entirely into the broom, and the dust, and the stone, and the light, and the question dissolved. Not because it had been answered, because it had run out of room. There was no space between what he was doing and what he thought he should be understanding. Because what he was doing was the whole of what was happening. The way the still water at the bottom of the bucket was the whole of what the bucket was. Below the surface, he kept sweeping. When the courtyard was done, he leaned the broom against the wall and stood in the last of the afternoon light. And he noticed that something which had been very tightly held in him for 3 years was, at this moment, not quite as tightly held. He did not try to find it, or look at it, or understand what it was. He went to the kitchen and helped with the evening rice. That evening, when Wenbo came to the kitchen step to collect his bowl, Cheng Hui was sitting nearby in the last of the light, mending a section of robe that had torn at the shoulder seam. He was putting the needle in and out of the cloth with the patience of someone who is doing a thing without thinking about whether it will be done. The old farmer looked at him for a moment and then said, "You swept the courtyard well today." Cheng Hui said, "You were not in the courtyard. You could not have seen the courtyard." Wenbo said, "I could not see it at all. But you have a different face." Cheng Hui sat with that for a long time. He thought about how the old farmer had seen something in him that Cheng Hui himself had barely felt. The way you sometimes learn about a change in yourself only when someone who knows your face says they can see it there. He thought about 40 years of carrying the same water and arriving at the same spring. And the thing in the bucket that had been there every single morning of all those years, not hiding, not difficult to find, only requiring that you stop walking long enough to look at what you were actually carrying. He thought about this at various points over the next 30 years. Not always, but the moments when he thought of it were the moments he learned to recognize as the moments when he was closest to the thing he had spent his life trying to describe to the monks who came to him later with their own versions of the same worry. The worry about whether they were understanding, whether they were doing it correctly, whether something that was supposed to happen was happening. He would tell them, "Carry the water." And when they asked him what he meant, he would say, "I mean exactly that. Carry the water. Walk the path. Let the surface move. And then stop walking for a moment and look at what is below the surface." Most of them understood this eventually. Some of them understood it during the walk. Some of them understood it only years later, in the middle of something else entirely. Wenbo brought the water every morning for 19 more years, in all weathers. Until the winter, he died quietly in his sleep beside his wife of 42 years. She told the monks the next morning that his face was the most peaceful she had seen it in all their years together, which was the most she had the words to say. Cheng Hui sat with the other monks in the hall and said what was said for a man who had given him something essential while not knowing he was giving anything at all. What he felt alongside the grief was something the grief sat inside of, a gratitude for which he did not have an adequate name, directed at an old man who had walked the same path for 40 years, and one morning stopped in the middle of it and looked into what he was carrying. "You have been carrying something today. The surface of it has been moving with everything the day asked of you. All the crossings and adjustments and unexpected reversals, back and forth, back and forth. But below all of it, something has not moved. Not this morning when the day began. Not now in the dark, in the quiet. It went where you went all day, and it is here now in the stillness. And it has never been disturbed by anything happening on the surface. Because it is not on the surface. Let the hands open now. Empty. Resting. You have been holding the bucket since morning. Feel what happens in the chest when you stop holding. The way a long carry leaves something in the shoulders even after the weight is gone. A warmth. A memory of the work. That warmth is real. You earned it today. Let it be there. The breath moves through you low and slow. The way water moves through the deepest part of a channel. Without urgency. Without being asked. In and out. The chest rises and falls. And below the chest, below the breath, something that is not breath and not thought and not the question you were turning over earlier. Something that simply is there, steady and undisturbed. The still water at the bottom, the part of you that has never been agitated, that has never needed to be calmed, that does not need peace because it has never been anything other than peace. You do not need to find it. You do not need to understand it. You only need to stop walking for long enough to let the surface settle, and then look low. Let the eyes close, or let them soften. Let the jaw release. Let the sounds of wherever you are simply be the sounds of wherever you are. Weather, texture, the ground note of the night. Something is already at rest. It has been at rest all day. And further north and west, high in the mountains, where the passes are cold even in summer, and the snow on the highest ridges does not fully melt from one year to the next, a young woman is kneeling at the edge of a river with wet cloth in her hands. She has been coming to this river every morning since her husband died 2 years ago, doing the work that needs doing, the cloth that needs washing. The river makes its sound beside her, the same sound it has made every morning, and she is only now beginning to hear in it something she has not heard before, though the river has been saying it all along. The river came down from somewhere above the snow line, and it was cold even in summer. Cold enough that Dawa's hands ached for the first few minutes every morning before they went numb, and then simply became part of the work. She had been coming to this place for 2 years. Not the same stretch of river. The river moved. Or rather, the river was always moving, and she was always arriving at a different version of it. Swollen in the thaw, thin in the dry weeks, carrying silt in one season and running clear in another, but the same flat rock that jutted out from the bank at the bend where the current slowed. The rock her mother-in-law had shown her in the first week after she came to the village as a bride, when she was 19 and everything about the valley was still unfamiliar, including her own name when it was said by people who had known each other for generations and were still deciding what to make of her. Her husband Tenzin had died in the late autumn of her first year here. A fall on the high pasture in October, when he was moving the yaks down before the first heavy snow. He did not suffer long. The village said this as a comfort, and it was a comfort, and it was also the only comfort, and it wore thinner some mornings than others. She was 21 now, and she came to the river every morning because the cloth needed washing and because this was where you washed it, and because the alternative was to stay in the small stone house on the eastern edge of the village and let the morning accumulate around her without moving, which she had tried for a while after Tenzin died and which had not helped her. The river helped her. or at least the river occupied her hands. And occupied hands were better than unoccupied hands when the thing you were carrying did not have a shape you could put down. The flat rock was cold under her knees. She had brought a folded piece of felt to kneel on, which her mother-in-law had suggested and which helped somewhat. The water came over the edge of the rock in a thin sheet that spread across the surface before dropping into the slower pool below. And Dawa worked the cloth in this thin sheet of moving water, pressing it against the rock and folding it and pressing again, the way her mother-in-law had shown her, which was also the way her mother-in-law's mother had shown her mother-in-law, and no doubt back through every woman who had knelt at this rock before them, each one teaching the next the particular pressure and fold that got the cold water through the weave of the heavy wool. Above her, the mountain filled half the sky. It was the mountain she had looked at every morning since she arrived in this valley, the one that stood behind the village, like something that had been there before the village and would be there after. Its upper slopes, white with permanent snow. Its lower slopes, the dark of old rock and the particular deep green of the high-altitude grasses that grew in the short summer and went brown and then white as the cold came. She had asked Tenzin the name of the mountain once, in their first weeks together, and he had said its name and then said, "We do not think about it much. It is just the mountain." She had thought this strange at the time. Now she understood it. The mountain was not something you thought about. It was something that was there while you were thinking about other things. The cold water moved over her hands, and she worked the cloth in it, and the sky above the mountain was the pale blue of high-altitude mornings, a blue that was not soft but precise, and the sound the river made was the sound it always made, which was the sound of a great deal of water moving quickly over and around rock, a sound that was both singular and made of many smaller sounds. The way a crowd is both one sound and the sound of many individual people who are not coordinating with each other. She had been listening to this sound for 2 years, and she had never thought much about it. It was simply the sound the river made. It was background. It was the thing the morning was made of while she did the work the morning required. But this morning something was different, and she could not say what. She had woken before the sky was light, the way she woke most mornings, with the particular alertness of someone whose sleep was useful but not deep, whose body rested but whose mind kept one hand on the door. She had lain in the dark for a while, listening to the sound of her mother-in-law's breathing from the other side of the room, steady and deep, the breathing of someone who had had more years to make peace with loss, or who perhaps simply slept more easily by constitution. Dawa did not know which it was. She had never asked. She had risen when the sky began to grey, and gathered the cloth that needed washing, and walked down the path to the river, past the other stone houses with their doors still shut, past the small shrine at the edge of the village where someone had left a butter lamp burning, its flame so small in the early morning light that she almost missed it. She had not thought about anything in particular on the walk down. She was simply doing the next thing. The way she had learned to do things in the past 2 years, not by deciding, but by continuing. The way the river continued without deciding to continue, because continuing was simply what rivers do. This was the problem she had been carrying without being able to name it, the thing that sat in her chest in the hours before sleep, that she did not know how to want things anymore. She had known how to want things when Tenzin was alive. She had wanted the house to be warm, the animals to be well, the seasons to come in their right order, Tenzin beside her in the cold. Those wants had been simple and clear, and she had moved through her days in the direction of them without having to think about moving. Now she moved through her days without direction. She did the things that needed doing, and the things that needed doing were done, and the next morning came and she did them again, and she was not unhappy. Exactly. Or not only unhappy, but she was not pointed at anything either. She was like the river in the slow stretch below the flat rock, where the water moved but without urgency, circling slightly before it found the main channel again. She pressed the cloth against the rock and folded it and pressed again. The sun had come over the ridge to the east and was beginning to touch the upper snowfields of the mountain, turning them from grey to rose to the particular white that was not white but the color of light itself. And the air was still cold, but beginning to carry the suggestion of warmth the way early morning air does. A promise rather than a delivery. Somewhere above the village, a dog barked twice and stopped. Dawa lifted the cloth from the water and wrung it, her hands working against each other with the automatic competence of someone who has done this so many times that the knowledge has moved out of the mind and into the muscle. She shook the cloth out and laid it on the dry part of the rock and looked at it for a moment, at the way the water still in the weave caught the early light, the cloth shining slightly the way wet stone shines. And then she looked at the river. This was when she heard it. Not something new. The river had been making this sound the entire time she had been kneeling at the rock, as it had been making this sound for the 2 years she had been coming here, as it had been making this sound for far longer than she had been alive, or her mother-in-law, or her mother-in-law's mother. The river had not changed, but something in how she was listening had changed, or something had stopped interfering with the listening, the way a room becomes audible when the talking stops. The river was not making one sound. She heard this now with the clarity of something that should have been obvious. The river was making many sounds at once, each one different, each one produced by a different piece of water moving against a different piece of rock or stone or the bank or another current. And all of them together made the sound she had been hearing for 2 years as a single thing. The way you hear a forest as a single green and do not see the individual trees until you stop walking and look. She sat back on her heels and simply listened. Below the sounds on the surface of the river, there was a deeper sound, not louder, not quieter. Deeper in the sense of being underneath, the way the sound of a great bell is underneath the ring of smaller bells, the sound of the main body of water moving, the bulk of the river below the surface turbulence, consistent and low and so steady that it was more like a silence than a sound. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so constant that the ear has stopped registering it as something that could stop. She thought about Tenzin, not the way she usually thought about him, which was with a kind of reflexive reaching, the mind going to the place he used to be and finding it empty. She thought about him the way you think about something that was real, fully and actually real, that does not become less real because it is past. He had walked to the high pasture on an October morning, and he had not come down. That was true. The truth of it did not change and would not change. But below the truth of the loss, which sat on the surface of everything, there was something that the loss had not changed and could not change. The fact of the time they had had, the warmth of it, the specific weight of him beside her in the dark. The loss floated on top of that the way the surface turbulence floated on top of the river's deeper body, real and moving, and not the whole of what was there. She did not think this. It came to her from below, thinking, the way the deeper sound of the river came from below the surface sounds, and she received it the way you receive something you were not expecting, with a stillness in the body that is not shock, but the opposite of shock, a settling. She stayed at the rock for a long time after the cloth was dry. Her mother-in-law was in the yard when she came back, feeding the 2 remaining goats the way she did every morning, talking to them in the low murmur she used for animals and very young children, a sound that was not quite words but was not words either, a sound that meant I see you. Here is what you need. She looked up when Dawa came through the gate with the wet cloth folded over her arm, and something in Dawa's face made her stop with the feed still in her hand. She said what happened. Dawa set the cloth down on the stone ledge near the door. She said, "I heard the river." Her mother-in-law was quiet for a moment. She had the quality that very old grief gives some people, of having been hollowed out by it and then filled back up with something quieter and more durable than what was there before. The way a clay pot that has been cracked and repaired with gold is not the same pot it was before, but is perhaps more interesting and definitely more itself. She had lost Tenzin's father when Tenzin was 7. She had raised Tenzin and his 2 sisters on the proceeds of the animals and the weaving and the goodwill of the village, and she had been at the flat rock every morning of that time, washing the cloth that needed washing. She said, "What did the river say?" Dawa thought about this for a moment. Then she said nothing. "The river does not say anything, but I heard something below it." Her mother-in-law nodded slowly, the way people nod when they hear something they have been waiting a long time to hear. She went back to feeding the goats. After a moment she said, "I went to that rock for 6 years before I heard it." "You heard it in 2. Dawa said, "What does it mean?" Her mother-in-law looked at her. She said that the part of you that is still here is louder than the part of you that is gone. She paused. Then she said, "It does not stay loud. Some mornings you will go back to the rock and hear only the surface. But now you know the other sound is there. You cannot unknow it." Dawa stood in the yard for a moment after her mother-in-law went inside with the feed bucket, looking at the mountain above the village, the white of the high snowfields in the full morning light now, solid and still and entirely unmoved by the small weather of the valley below it. She thought about what her mother-in-law had said. The part of you that is still here is louder than the part that is gone. She had not thought of it that way before. She had thought of grief as something that was added to you, a weight you carried on top of what you already were, heavy and present and impossible to put down. She had not thought of what was underneath the grief, the thing the grief was resting on, the thing that made it possible to carry the grief at all, which was not nothing, which was not emptiness, which was something with its own sound, low and constant and more like a silence than a sound, because it had always been there. She went inside and started the morning fire. She went back to the rock every morning for the rest of the year, and in the years that followed, and she did not hear the deeper sound every time. Some mornings it was there from the first moment she knelt at the rock, clear and unmistakable below the surface. Turbulence? Other mornings she could not find it at all, and she pressed the cloth against the stone and worked the water through the weave, and the grief sat in her chest, and the river made only its surface sound. But she had heard it once, and her mother-in-law was right. You cannot unknow a thing you have genuinely heard. It was in her now, the way the river was in the valley, not always audible, not always present to the surface attention, but there, below everything, going where it went. She was still in the village when she was very old, her hair white, her hands, the hands of someone who has knelt at cold water for 6 decades. The young women came to her sometimes, the ones who had lost someone and were trying to learn how to continue without direction, without the clear wanting they had had before. She always told them the same thing. She said, go to the river, not to think about it, not to find comfort. Just go to the river and wash what needs washing. And at some point the river will say something to you. She was always asked, what will it say? And she always said, the river does not speak, but you will hear it anyway. Something in you has been listening to a sound below the surface of today. You may not have known this while it was happening. Most days you do not notice it. The way you do not notice the deeper current in the river while you are looking at the surface. The surface is what is most visible, most insistent, most demanding of attention. And the surface has been busy today, with everything that surfaces are busy with. But the deeper sound has been there. It is always there. It is what the quiet is made of. When the quiet finally comes, let the body go somewhere it has been trying to go all day. The heaviness in the legs, if there is heaviness. The ache behind the eyes, if there is an ache. These are the body asking to be allowed to stop, and you can allow it right now, completely. Feel the breath come in low, to the belly, the way breath goes when the chest has finally stopped bracing, and then out, slowly, the way water leaves a cloth when you have pressed it enough and the cloth is beginning to give. There is no hurrying the out-breath. It knows when it is done. The part of you that is still here is not small. It is not diminished by what you have been carrying. It is the thing that has been carrying the carrying, the thing underneath the loss and the tiredness and the long day. And it is large enough and old enough and quiet enough that the surface noise of any single day does not reach it. You do not have to find it tonight. You only have to stop working against it. Let the jaw soften. Let the hands be open on whatever they are resting on, loose and empty. The hands of someone who has set the cloth down. And somewhere further east, in a pine-shadowed valley where the mountains are older and lower and the winters come slowly, a man is sitting in front of an unfinished bowl of clay, and he has just discovered that the thing he has been trying to force into shape is already the shape it wants to be, and that he has been the only thing standing between the clay and what the clay knew how to become. The fire in the kitchen at Iheiji had to be started before the bell rang for the first sitting, which meant that Ryokan was awake before anyone else in the monastery. Awake in the particular way of someone whose body has learned over many years to surface from sleep at a specific hour without being called. The way water knows to find the lowest point without being shown. He was 51 years old. He had been the tenzo at Daihaiji for 9 years. The cook, the one responsible for what the monks ate and when they ate it and how it was prepared. The one who decided each morning which vegetables from the garden would go into the morning rice gruel and which would be set aside for the midday meal. It was not a position that anyone spoke about with admiration. The monks who received Dharma transmission and the monks who could recite the entire Shobogenzo from memory and the monks who sat in zazen for 12 hours without moving were the ones people spoke about. The tenzo was the one who made sure there was rice. Dogen had written about the tenzo. Ryokan knew this because Dogen had written about everything, and because he had read the section on the tenzo's duties carefully when he was appointed, wanting to understand what was being asked of him. Dogen had said that the position of tenzo was not less than the position of any other monk, that cooking for the community was the same practice as sitting in the hall, that the way you washed rice and the way you sat in zazen were not two different activities, but one activity in different forms. Ryokan had read this and understood it as doctrine. He had not yet understood it as experience. The kitchen was cold at this hour. The stone floor held the cold of the night and the cold of the mountain, which was a cold that went deeper than weather, a cold that came from the altitude and the age of the stone, and from the particular quality of stillness that existed in places that had been built for stillness and had been still for a very long time. Ryokan's feet knew this cold without being surprised by it. He moved to the hearth and began laying the fire the way he laid the fire every morning. The dry pine shavings first, then the small kindling crosswise, then the larger pieces of wood that would hold the heat once the fire had established itself. The smell of pine resin rose as the shavings caught, sharp and clean, a smell that was also the smell of the mountain and the smell of the morning and the smell. Ryokan had come to think of something being begun rather than continued. Each morning the fire was new. Each morning the same fire. He filled the pot with water from the stone cistern and set it to hang above the fire and stood for a moment, watching the flames establish themselves, the way he had stood watching them every morning for 9 years, not thinking about anything in particular, simply present to the fire and the water and the cold kitchen and the silence that surrounded the kitchen on all sides, the silence of monks still sleeping, the silence of the mountain still dark. Outside, the bell had not yet rung. The question that had been with Ryokan for several weeks, sitting in the back of the kitchen of his mind, the way a pot sits at the back of the stove, warm but not yet ready. Was this, the abbot had told him 3 weeks before, that a monk from a distant province was coming to evaluate Aiheji's practice for the purposes of the broader Soto community, and that this monk would be eating in the kitchen with the others, and that it would be good if the meals during this period were particularly fine. Ryokan had bowed and said he understood. He did not understand, not the request itself, which was simple enough. He understood the request. What he did not understand was what he was supposed to do with it, because for 9 years he had cooked the same way every morning, which was to say, he had cooked with what was available, the vegetables from the garden in their season, the rice in its proper proportion, the miso that had been fermenting in the large crock in the corner since autumn. And he had cooked this way not because it was the best way or the most virtuous way, but because it was the only way that made sense to him. The way the river flows downhill, not because it has chosen downhill, but because downhill is simply where water goes. To cook particularly fine meals for the evaluating monk was to cook differently for one person than for everyone else, which was, to say it was, to make the meal about the person eating it, rather than about the cooking itself. And Ryokan had spent 9 years learning, or trying to learn, that the cooking was not about the person eating it. The cooking was about the cooking. That was the thing Dogen had written that Ryokan had been slowly, imperfectly, arriving at for 9 years. He stood in front of the fire and watched the water in the pot begin to move. The garden at Aiheji in the 6th month was a particular kind of abundance, the kind that comes from a long cold and a short warmth, where everything that can grow is growing urgently and without reservation, because the season is brief and the brief season is all there is. The monks worked the garden in the afternoon hours, and Ryokan had learned over 9 years to know the garden by its smell, before he knew it by its look. The smell of the soil after the monks had been working in it, which was the smell of something opened that had been closed, the smell of the inside of the earth meeting the outside of the earth, cool and dark, and holding the particular richness of a soil that had been amended carefully for many years by people who understood that what you give to the soil is what the soil gives back. He had started as Tenzo without wanting the position. The previous Tenzo had become ill in the autumn of Ryokan's third year at Eiheiji, and the abbot had asked him to take over the kitchen until the man recovered. And the man had not recovered, and Ryokan had continued. And at some point, the temporary had become the permanent, in the way that things become permanent when you are not watching the moment of their becoming. He had never been consulted about whether he wanted it. In the Soto way, you were given the work that needed doing, and the work became the practice, and the practice was not separate from the life. And so the kitchen had become his life, in the way the garden had become the monk's life who tended it, through daily and repeated contact, until the distinction between the person and the work became a formality that no longer described anything real. He had not thought of himself as practicing when he was cooking. He had thought of himself as cooking. The distinction seemed important in theory and invisible in practice. The water boiled or it did not. The rice was done or it needed more time. The miso needed to be added after the heat was low or it lost something essential, and the soup became only soup rather than something more than soup. These were things you attended to. They were also... Ryokan had slowly come to understand exactly the things that Zazen attended to, the small precise facts of what was happening right now, which were the only facts available, and which were sufficient if you were willing to let them be sufficient. What he had been trying to do in the weeks before Shugen arrived was to add something to this, to make the cooking mean more than it meant, to make it address someone. And the cooking had noticed. The cooking had made itself known by burning the rice, which was its way of saying you have left. Come back. He had come back, and the rice had been rice again, and the morning had been what mornings were, and the question of what the evaluating monk would think had become, not unimportant, but smaller than the fire and the water and the work in the hands. The evaluating monk arrived on a Tuesday in the 6th month, when the garden was at its most generous, and the mountain above the monastery was in the full green of its short summer, and his name was Shugen, and he was perhaps 35, young for the gravity he carried with him, young for the way the other monks deferred to him when he entered a room. He had studied at Sojiji for 12 years, and he had the quality of someone who had sat in meditation for a very long time, and had found in that sitting not peace exactly, but a kind of thorough acquaintance with himself that most people spend their lives avoiding. He came to the kitchen on his first morning and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Ryokan work, the way a person stands at the edge of a garden to see it before entering it. Ryokan looked up. He said, "Come in. There is room." Shugen came in and sat on the low bench near the wall, out of the way of the work, and watched. He did not speak. Ryokan did not speak either. The morning had enough sound in it already. The fire, the water, the knife against the board, the particular sound of rice washing in the wooden basin, a soft, shuffling sound, like something thinking in a lower register. For 3 mornings, Shugen came to the kitchen and sat on the bench and watched. He ate what Ryokan prepared without comment, in the way monks eat, attending to the food itself rather than to opinions about the food. On the 4th morning he arrived early, before Ryokan had finished laying the fire, and he helped with the wood without being asked, placing the larger pieces where Ryokan needed them placed, not directing, but assisting. The way a good student enters the presence of a practice they want to understand. On the 5th morning, he said, "May I ask you something?" Ryokan said, "Yes." Shugen said, "You were told I was coming. You were told to prepare particularly fine meals." Ryokan said, "I was." Shugen said, "And yet you have cooked the same way you always cook. I have eaten here before." 7 years ago, and it tastes the same." Ryokan was quiet for a moment, his hands still in the rice water. Then he said, "I tried to cook differently. In the first week, after the abbot told me you were coming, I tried to think about what particularly fine cooking would mean. I thought about it for 3 days." Shugen said, "And?" Ryokan said, "I could not find it. I kept arriving back at the rice and the vegetables and the miso. I kept arriving back at what was available in this season in this garden. Whatever I tried to add to that was not from the cooking. It was from wanting you to think well of the cooking." Shugen was quiet. Ryokan went back to washing the rice. After a while, he said, "Dogen wrote that the Tenzo must handle rice as one handles the eyes. I have been thinking about what that means for 9 years. I think it means the rice is not for anyone. The rice is rice. The handling is the practice. If I cook for you, I am not cooking." Shugen said, "Who are you cooking for?" Ryokan thought about this. He said, "I do not know how to answer that. I cook because the morning requires it. I cook because the monks will be hungry after sitting. I cook the way the fire burns, not because I have decided to burn, but because burning is what fire does when conditions are right." Shugen looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said, "I have been to 11 monasteries in the past year, evaluating their practice. Do you know what the difference is between the ones that are practicing and the ones that are performing practice?" Ryokan said, "I think I might know, but I would like to hear you say it." Shugen said, "It is exactly what you just described. The ones that are performing practice cook differently when someone is watching. The ones that are practicing cook the same way they always cook. They cannot help it. The cooking has gone below the place where self-consciousness lives. And you taste it. You taste the difference in the rice." They were quiet together for a while, the fire settling into its work, the water beginning to move in the pot, the cold of the early morning giving way to the warmth of the fire, spreading through the stone kitchen. Then Shugen said, "What made you stop trying to cook differently?" Ryokan said, "I burned the rice. On the 3rd morning, while I was trying to think about what the abbot wanted, I let the fire get too high and the rice at the bottom of the pot burned. I stood looking at the burned rice, and I thought, you have been cooking rice for 9 years, and you just burned it because you were thinking about cooking it." He paused. He said, "So I stopped thinking about it and cooked the rice." Shugen said, "And the rice was good." Ryokan said the rice was rice. Shugen left Eiheiji at the end of the 2nd week, and Ryokan did not know what report he made to the broader Soto community, because no one told him and he did not ask. The abbot came to the kitchen a month later and said that the evaluation had gone well and that the monastery had been commended. Ryokan bowed and thanked him, and went back to washing the morning rice. He thought about the conversation with Shugen for many years after, not because it had told him something he did not know, but because Shugen had said out loud something that Ryokan had been approaching for 9 years without quite arriving at. The way you approach a door in the dark and keep almost touching it with your outstretched hand, and then one morning, your hand simply finds it. Shugen had not given Ryokan the insight. Ryokan had been building it for 9 years in the kitchen every morning, one bowl of rice at a time, one pot of water over one fire. Shugen had only been the moment when the hand finally touched the door. He remained Tenzo at Eiheiji for another 22 years, until he was 73, when the abbot decided it was time for someone younger to take over the work, and Ryokan moved to a small room near the garden and grew the vegetables he had been cooking for 3 decades, which was a form of continuity he had not anticipated and found entirely suitable. The monks who had eaten his cooking for those years remembered it not as fine or distinguished in the way of cooking that has been designed to be remembered, but as nourishing. The word that means both fed and something more than fed. The word that means the body received what the body needed and did not notice the cooking because the cooking had not called attention to itself, had not placed itself between the food and the person eating, had not wanted anything from the eating. The cooking had only been cooking, and this was, it turned out, the finest thing it could be. There is something you do that has gone below the level where you think about doing it. You may not know what it is. Most people do not know what their deepest competence is, because the things that have gone below the level of thinking do not announce themselves. They are simply what happens when you are sufficiently present to the work in front of you and sufficiently absent from the part of you that wants the work to be noticed. You have been present to something today. Not perfectly, not without distraction, but sufficiently. You kept going when it was unclear whether the going was producing anything worth keeping. You did the next thing because the next thing was what was in front of you. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. Let the hands rest now. The way Ryokan's hands rested after the last pot was washed and the kitchen fire was banked for the night. Loose and warm and finished with their work for the day. Feel the weight of the body being held without your help. You have been holding yourself upright since morning, and you do not have to do that now. Let the chair or the bed or the floor do the holding. It is what they are for. The breath comes in without being asked. It has been doing this all day, through the work and the uncertainty and the small burns along the way. Through every moment when the attention left the rice and went somewhere else and then came back to find the rice still there, requiring only that you return to it. Let it come in low, to the belly. Let it go slowly. Somewhere below the part of you that is reviewing the day and somewhere below the part that is thinking about tomorrow. The cooking is still happening. The deep work, the kind that has gone below the level of thought. It does not stop when you stop. It is simply what you do when conditions are right. The way fire burns and water flows and rice becomes soft when heated long enough in enough water. You do not need to manage it tonight. You only need to let it continue. Let the jaw go soft. Let the eyes be where they are. Let whatever sound the night makes around you simply be the sound of the night. Neither something to attend to, nor something to resist. Something in you knows how to cook in the dark. And, a little north of here, across a narrow sea and into a country where the winters are long and the mountains are old and the monasteries sit on high ground that was chosen for its difficulty, a man is sitting in front of a potter's wheel in the blue light before dawn, and the clay between his hands has just done something he did not ask it to do, and it is more beautiful for that. And he is trying to understand whether his hands made it or whether his hands simply allowed it, and whether there is a difference. The kiln had been burning for 3 days, and Jae-won had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in all that time. This was not unusual. The firing required someone to tend it through the night, feeding wood into the mouth of the kiln at intervals that the fire itself determined, not by any schedule Jae-won had written down, but by the sound the fire made and the color visible through the small opening at the kiln's side and the particular smell of the air around the kiln, when the temperature was right and when it was not. These were things you learned over time and could not be taught directly, only arrived at through enough firings that the knowledge moved from the mind into something below the mind. The same place where Jae-won's hands knew how to center clay on the wheel without his eyes having to confirm it. He was 44 years old and he had been making celadon for 22 years. Since the age of 22, when he came to study under the old potter Chun in the valley below the Seon monastery on the eastern slope of the mountain. A man of tremendous quietness who had spent 40 years discovering what Celadon wanted to be and had arrived at a simplicity so refined that it looked to uninformed eyes like the work of a beginner. Jae-won had spent 5 years with Chun before the old man died, leaving him the kiln and the tools and the particular clay bed in the hillside from which Chun had dug his clay for 40 years, and leaving him also the specific unwritten knowledge of the firing, which could not be written down because it existed only in the body of someone who had done it enough times to stop thinking about it. The monastery above the valley sent its monks down to Jae-won twice a year, before the summer rains and before the winter snows, to order Celadon bowls for the community. The monks were not extravagant in their requests. They asked for what they needed and described what they needed simply, and Jae-won made what they asked for, which was always the same thing. Bowls of a particular size that could hold a full portion of rice and a pair of chopsticks across the rim without sliding, and which would last through the daily use of monastic life without chipping at the lip. The bowls were not decorative. The monks did not want decoration. They wanted bowls that performed their function with integrity, which in Jae-won's understanding was the same thing as beauty, though he would not have used that word for it. He would have said the bowl must know what it is for. The kiln this week held something other than the monastery's order. It held a bowl that Jae-won had been trying to make for 3 years. Not the monastery bowls, which he could make in his sleep and sometimes did, or close enough to sleep that the difference was academic. This was a bowl he had been making for himself, or for no one, or for the question he had been carrying for 3 years, which was whether it was possible to make a bowl that did not announce itself. Not a plain bowl, not an undecorated bowl, but a bowl in which the making was so completely present and so completely invisible that a person could hold it and feel held by something they could not name, could not point to in the object, could not say there, "That is the thing that did this to me." He had failed to make this bowl 14 times. The failures were not failures of technique. His technique was sound. The failures were failures of something he had no word for in the language of pottery. Something like intention. Something like the wanting that got into the clay when he was thinking too hard about what he was trying to make, which was the wanting that made the bowl announce itself rather than simply be. The 15 attempts at this bowl had each failed in the same way, though he could not have told anyone this because the failures looked different on the outside. The first had been too thick at the base, a heaviness that came from overworking the clay, from too much handling by hands that were trying to get something right. The third had cracked in the cooling. The seventh had a glaze that was beautiful in the way of something that is trying to be beautiful. A self-consciousness in the surface that you could feel if you held it and were honest with yourself about what you were feeling. Chun had told him once, in the 5th year, that a bowl knows what you were thinking when you made it. Jae-won had thought this was poetry. He had come to understand it was description. The bowl he was trying to make had no particular form he could articulate. It was not a shape in his mind. It was more like a quality, a condition he was reaching toward the way you reach toward warmth in a cold room, knowing the warmth exists without knowing exactly where the warmth is. He wanted to make something that a monk could hold during the morning meal and feel, without knowing why, that the bowl was not separate from the eating, that the thing holding the food and the hands holding the bowl and the mourning and the hunger and the sitting were all continuous, were all one thing, doing one thing, and that the bowl had known this about itself before the monk picked it up. He had told the abbot this once, at a monastery meal, and the abbot had looked at him for a moment and said, "You are trying to make a bowl that has no abbot, Jae-won had not understood this then. He thought he understood it now. Sitting with his back against the warm stone of the kiln on the third morning, too tired to impose anything on anyone, the bowl inside the kiln either becoming itself or not becoming itself, and neither outcome requiring anything more from him. The monastery on the hill had been there for 200 years. The kiln in the valley had been there for 60, built by the man who taught the man who taught Chun, and the clay bed in the hillside had been dug by all of them in turn, each generation finding the same grey-blue clay at the same depth and doing with it what their particular hands knew how to do, which was, in Jae-won's case, to make bowls for monks who were trying to eat without performing eating, which was the same thing. It occurred to him now as what he was trying to do with the bowl. He was trying to make without performing making. The kiln held the heat of 3 days. It held the bowl. It did not know what the bowl was supposed to be, and so the bowl was simply becoming what the firing allowed it to become, which was the only thing the firing had ever allowed anything to become. The morning of the third day, the fire had settled into the particular steadiness that meant the temperature inside the kiln was holding, not climbing, not falling, simply present at the point where Celadon became what it was going to be. The sky to the east above the mountain was the color that comes just before the actual color of sunrise, a gray that is not dark and not light and is honest about not being either. Jae-won sat on the low stool outside the kiln door, with his back against the warm stone of the kiln's outer wall, and let the heat come through the stone into his back, which was tired from 3 days of intermittent waking and working. And he was not thinking about the bowl inside the kiln. He was too tired to think about it. He was thinking about nothing, or close to nothing. A state of mind that was not quite sleep, and not quite waking, and that he had learned to value over 22 years of late firings, because it was in this state that his hands were most honest, before the mind woke up fully and began to have opinions. A monk from the monastery was coming down the hillside path. Jae-won watched him come. The monk was young, perhaps 20, moving down the steep path with the careful attention of someone for whom the mountain was still something to negotiate rather than something to move through. He came to the flat ground near the kiln and stopped a few paces away and bowed. He said, "I am sorry to disturb you. I am Hyun-sik. The abbot sent me to ask about the monastery's order." Jae-won said, "The firing is not finished. Another day, perhaps 2. Hyun-sik nodded. He showed no sign of leaving, and Jae-won, who was too tired for the social navigation required to dismiss a politely present person, simply did not dismiss him. The monk sat down on the ground near the kiln without being invited, cross-legged, with the practiced ease of someone who has been sitting in one form or another since childhood, and looked at the kiln. After a while, he said, "What is in there besides the monastery bowls?" Jae-won looked at him. He said, "One other bowl." Hyun-sik said, "What kind?" Jae-won thought about how to answer this. Then he said, "I have been trying to make a bowl that does not try to be anything for 3 years." Hyun-sik said, "And has it worked?" Jae-won said, "I do not know. It is in the kiln. I will not know until I open the kiln." They sat in silence for a while. The fire made a low sound inside the kiln. The mountain above them was beginning to take on the color of the actual sunrise now, the gray becoming gold at the ridgeline. A bird somewhere in the pines began a sound and stopped. Then Hyun-sik said, "May I ask what you mean by trying to be something?" Jae-won said, "When I know too clearly what I want the bowl to be, the bowl knows it. The bowl becomes that thing rather than itself. You can feel it in the object, a kind of effort, like a person who is trying to appear calm. Hyun-sik was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I know that feeling. We call it performing practice." Jae-won looked at him. He said, "What do you do about it?" Hyun-sik said, "We sit until the performing falls away. It takes a long time. Sometimes it takes years. And then one morning you sit down and there is only the sitting. And the sitting is enough. And you stop being aware of whether anyone is watching because the watching no longer matters." He paused. He said, "I think I am still years away from that, but I have been told it happens." Jae-won looked at the kiln. He said, "I have been told that too. I have been told it by my own hands. When I am tired enough that the telling myself what to make falls away and the hands simply make. The bowls from those hours are always the better bowls. I know this. I know it every time. And then I start a new bowl and I begin telling myself what to make again." Hyun-sik said, "Why?" Jae-won was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think because the part of me that wants to make a good bowl does not trust the part of me that makes good bowls without trying." The monk looked at the kiln for a long time. Then he said something that Jae-won had not expected. He said, "That is exactly what I am working on." They sat beside the kiln until the sun was fully up, not speaking. The fire steady inside the stone, the mountain bright above them. Two people in the presence of something that was becoming what it was going to be without being told what to be. Jae-won opened the kiln the following evening, when the stone had cooled enough to touch without burning. He lifted the monastery bowls out first, holding each one in both hands and turning it slowly in the last of the daylight, checking the lip, the foot, the interior, the glaze. They were good. They were what the monastery needed, and they would last. And they were not trying to be anything other than what they were. He set them on the low table near the kiln door in a row and looked at them with the specific satisfaction of work that has accomplished what it set out to accomplish. Then he reached into the back of the kiln, where he had placed the 15th bowl, the one that had been 3 years in arriving. He held it in both hands and stood still for a moment before he looked at it. When he looked at it, he understood. The bowl was celadon, the grey-green of the glaze that Chan had spent 40 years refining, and that Jae-won had spent 22 years continuing to refine after him. A color that was not quite the color of jade, and not quite the color of deep water, but somewhere between them. The color of something that has been carefully arrived at over a very long time. The surface was not plain and not decorated. It had in it the slight variations that come from a glaze that has been given room to do what it does. Small movements in the color, a deepening here, a lightening there. Nothing that a person would notice and then set down to describe, but something that a person would feel in the hands and not be able to name. The bowl was not the bowl he had been trying to make. It was a bowl he had made at the moment when, sometime in the second night of the firing, he had become too tired to try to make the bowl he was trying to make. He had not known this while it was happening. He had been feeding wood into the kiln in the dark and watching the color of the fire through the opening. And at some point, his mind had simply released the bowl inside and gone to whatever the mind goes to when it is too tired to go anywhere useful. And the bowl inside the kiln had become only clay and heat, and the glaze doing what glaze does when the temperature is held long enough. The bowl that came out of that had no effort in it. You could feel this in your hands. It was not trying to be unefforted. It simply was. The way the river was simply water moving because water moves. The way the mountain above the valley was simply stone, because stone is what it had been given to be. Jaewon set the bowl down on the table beside the monastery bowls and sat on the low stool and looked at all of them in the evening light. And the evening light was as honest as morning light. And what it showed him was that the monastery bowls and this bowl were the same in the way that mattered, which was that none of them were asking for anything from the person who held them. They were only themselves. And that was the thing that Chun had spent 40 years learning, and that Jaewon had spent 22 years arriving at the edge of, and that he had crossed into on a night when he was too tired to stand in his own way. He brought the monastery's bowls up the hillside path the next morning, and the young monk Hyunsik was the one who received them at the gate. He took the wrapped package from Jaewon and then said the other bowl, "Did you open the kiln?" Jaewon said yes. Hyunsik said, and Jaewon thought about how to answer. Then he said, "It is a bowl. It knows what it is. I did not teach it this." Hyunsik was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is what we are all trying for. I think, to be the thing we are, without teaching." Jaewon walked back down the hillside in the morning light, and the path under his feet was the path he had walked for 22 years. And the kiln was below in the valley waiting to be loaded again, and the bowl was on the table in his house, simply there, asking nothing, a thing that had become itself on a night when no one was trying to make it become anything. And this seemed to him to be the most important thing a thing could be. Something in you has been in the kiln, not all day, not since morning, something longer than today, something that has been in the heat and the slow change for longer than any single day could account for. The part of you that does not know how to explain itself, the part that works in the dark and the quiet, while the rest of you is busy managing the visible things. That part has been at the temperature where Celadon becomes what it is, and the work has been happening even when you have not been able to see it. You do not have to see it tonight. You only have to rest while it continues. Feel the warmth of the body, the specific warmth of a body that has been working all day. Not the heat of effort, but the warmth of use. The warmth of a kiln that has been doing what kilns do for hours. Even now, even as the day ends and the fire is banked down, let the hands be open. Let the feet go heavy. Let the shoulders release the distance they have been holding themselves from everything. The breath is low and slow. It has the rhythm of something that has found its pace. You do not need to do anything with it. You only need to not interfere. There is a bowl forming inside you that you have not been able to see yet. It does not need your help tonight. It needs the dark and the quiet and the heat that is already there. Steady. The way the kiln is steady when the temperature is right and the potter has finally sat down and let the fire do what fire does. Let the body do what the body does in the dark and the quiet. Let the day's work settle into whatever it is going to become. And not far away, across the water and a short stretch of southern land, where the evenings are warm even in autumn and the scent of something flowering comes through an open door, a young woman is sitting at the edge of a tea garden in the last light of the day, and she has just understood something about the leaves in her hand that has nothing to do with tea. The tea garden at Thap Thap was at its best in the hour before the heat came, when the dew was still on the leaves and the light came through the hills at a low angle that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. Lin had been picking tea since she was 7 years old, when her mother first put her hands on the upper shoots of the bush and showed her the difference between a leaf that was ready and a leaf that needed another day. Her mother had learned from her mother, and her mother's mother had learned from the women of the village. and all of them had learned from the same bushes, which had been planted on this hillside 3 generations ago, when the land was first given to the temple, and the monks had asked the village to tend the tea in exchange for the use of the lower field for rice. She was 19 now, and she came to the garden every morning before the rest of the village was fully awake, in the blue dark before sunrise, and she moved through the rows of tea bushes with the basket over her arm, and her hands moving through the leaves the way water moves through reeds, not pushing but finding, not taking but receiving what was ready to be received. The bushes were chest-high and dense, their leaves a deep green that was almost black in the low morning light, and they held the dew in the particular way of leaves that have been watered from inside rather than from above, the dew beading on the surface and catching whatever light there was, so that moving through the garden in the early morning was like moving through something that was quietly lit from within. The temple sat at the lower edge of the garden, its gate visible from the upper rows where Lin was working this morning, the roof tiles dark against the sky that was beginning in the east above the hills to make the first suggestion of the color it was going to be. From inside the gate came the sound of a bell, struck once and then allowed to ring until it decided to stop, which took longer than you would expect, the sound thinning slowly into the air the way smoke thins, becoming less a sound and more a memory of a sound, and then nothing. The monks had been at Thap Thap for 30 years now, since the master, Win Tu, had established the temple in the year that Lin's grandmother was a young woman. Her grandmother had told her about that time, about the monks arriving from across the sea with their robes and their texts and their particular way of moving through a space as though the space were also practice, as though the ground under the foot were also something you could attend to. Her grandmother had found this strange at first. Then she had found it ordinary. Then she had found it in the way of things that have been ordinary for long enough. Simply true. Lin found it neither strange nor ordinary. She had grown up beside the temple, the way she had grown up beside the tea garden, which was to say it was simply the place she was, and the monks were simply the people who lived at the edge of her world, and their practice was simply what they did in the way that picking tea was simply what she did. 2 forms of attention operating in the same hillside without needing to explain themselves to each other. The morning this story belongs to was the morning of the 7th day of the 7th month, the day before the temple's annual ceremony, when the monks would offer the season's finest tea to the altar and to the community. Lin had been asked to bring the temple's portion before sunrise, and she had come to the garden earlier than usual, in the full dark, with a lamp she extinguished when the sky began to give enough light to work by. She had been told by her mother, years ago, that a good tea picker does not take the leaf. She receives it. The distinction had seemed like a kind of poetry when she was young, the sort of thing adults say to children that sounds meaningful and arrives at meaning only much later. The way a seed arrives at the tree, it was always going to become. She understood it now as something practical and physical, a description of what actually happened in the hands of someone who had been doing this long enough. The taking was what you did when you were tired or distracted, when the hands moved through the leaves without the rest of you following, the hands grabbing at what was in front of them rather than attending to what was ready. The receiving was what happened when the attention and the hands were the same thing, when there was no gap between what the eyes noticed and what the fingers found, when the upper shoot came away from the stem the way it wanted to come away, cleanly, without resistance, because the timing was right and the hands had known the timing was right without being told. On the mornings when the receiving was happening, the garden was different. Not the garden itself, which was always the same hillside with the same bushes and the same quality of early light. Something in how the garden arrived at her was different. The way the same room can feel different depending on how awake you are when you enter it. The garden, on a receiving morning, was more itself, if that was possible, more present, more in the conversation. She had never told anyone this because she did not know how to say it without it sounding like the kind of thing you say when you are being romantic about work. It was not romantic. It was practical. It was the difference between a basket of tea that would steep into something thin and the tea that would steep into something that made the person drinking it pause, mid-cup, and not quite know why they had paused. The Venerable Min knew the difference. He had been drinking the temple's tea for 30 years, and he knew which mornings it had been picked in the receiving way and which mornings in the taking way. And he never commented on it, because commenting would have changed it. He simply drank the tea and let it be what it was, which was the same practice he applied to sitting and to eating and to walking the covered corridor between the meditation hall and the kitchen, which was, be entirely where you are, and the where will be sufficient. Lin did not know he knew this, but she suspected it, the way you suspect a thing you cannot confirm, through the small evidence of how a person receives what you give them, whether they receive it with their whole attention or with only part of it, the part that is not already somewhere else. The question she had been carrying since the evening before was not about the tea. It was about a thing the head monk, the Venerable Min, had said to her grandmother, who had reported it to Lin the way she reported most things of importance, obliquely, while doing something else entirely, in this case, stirring rice. She had said, "Min told me this morning that the ceremony tea is not the same as the daily tea." Lin had said, "What does that mean?" Her grandmother had stirred the rice and said, "I do not know. That is why I'm telling you." Lin had thought about this through the evening and through the early hours of the night before sleep came. She had picked temple tea 100 times. She did not know what would make it different from the tea she picked on any other morning, except that today she was picking it for a specific occasion, which seemed to her a difference in how it was going to be used and not a difference in what it was. She was working in the upper rows, her hands moving through the leaves in the familiar way, when she became aware of something she could not at first name. She had been picking for perhaps an hour, moving steadily through the upper rows from east to west, the way she always moved, and her hands had been doing what her hands did in the garden, which was to find the upper shoot of each stem, the 2 leaves and the bud that indicated readiness, and to take it cleanly between thumb and forefinger and drop it into the basket, all without the eyes being required to manage the hands. The hands, knowing what they were looking for without looking. This was the deep competence of a thing done 10,000 times, the knowledge that had moved from the mind into the body and then further into something below the body's awareness, operating without being called. But this morning the hands had begun to slow, not because she was tired, not because the leaves were difficult. The hands were slowing in the way that hands slow when they have become interested in what they are touching, when the touching has become more than instrumental, when what was a means has become, without announcement, an end. She stopped walking and stood in the row and looked at her hands. They were holding the upper shoot of a bush she had passed 100 times. 2 leaves and a bud, the bud still tightly furled. The leaves are dark green with lighter veins, wet from the dew. The specific coolness of them against her fingertips, unlike the coolness of anything else she had touched this morning. She was not thinking about the shoot. She was simply holding it. And the holding was taking the whole of her attention in a way that the 10,000 previous holdings had not. She let go of the shoot without picking it. She stood in the row for a moment, her basket over one arm and her hands at her sides, and she did not know what had just happened, except that something had, and that she was going to have to think about it before she could continue. She sat down at the edge of the row in the wet grass, which was cold and did not matter, and she thought, what she arrived at, after a while, was this. She had been picking tea this morning for the ceremony. She had been thinking about the ceremony, about the altar, about the Venerable Min's hands receiving the basket, about whether the leaves she chose would be considered worthy. She had been picking tea with an aim, and the aim had been between her and the tea had been, in some sense, incidental to the aim. And then at some point in the past hour, the aim had fallen away, or she had fallen away from the aim, and she had been simply in the garden with the tea and the dew and the particular coolness of the upper shoots against her fingertips, and the tea had become what it was when there was no ceremony to be picked for, which was what it always was, a leaf on a bush in the early morning on a hillside, complete in itself, requiring nothing from her except this particular quality of attention. She sat in the wet grass and felt the dew soaking through her trousers and did not move for a while. The sky above the hills was becoming the color it was going to be. The temple bell rang again from below the garden, a different bell this time, smaller and higher, the one that called the monks to the morning meal. A bird she did not know the name of crossed the sky from east to west above the highest row of tea bushes, low enough that she could hear the sound of its wings. She understood, sitting there, what her grandmother had been told and what her grandmother had passed to her in the only way her grandmother knew how to pass things, which was sideways, while doing something else, without explanation. The ceremony tea was not different from the daily tea. The ceremony was the daily tea, seen clearly. The daily tea, given full attention, was already the ceremony. She stood up and picked up her basket and went back to the upper row and continued picking, and her hands moved through the leaves the way they had always moved, and the light came stronger over the hills, and the dew began to lift from the leaves in the warmth, and she picked with an attention that was not different from her usual attention, except that she was aware of it. And being aware of it made it feel like something she had been given rather than something she had made. She brought the basket to the temple gate when the sun had cleared the hills and the garden was fully bright and the dew was gone from the upper leaves, and the Venerable Min received it at the gate with both hands and looked at the leaves for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "How long have you been picking tea?" Lin said, "Since I was 7. He said, "And this morning?" She thought about how to answer. Then she said, "This morning, I forgot I was picking it for the ceremony." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And what happened then?" She said, "I stopped. And then I continued. But it was different." He said, "What was different?" She said, "I do not know how to say it. The leaves were the same leaves. My hands were the same hands. But I was not in the way of either." The Venerable Min looked at the basket of leaves for a long time. Then he said, "This is the ceremony tea." She said, "It is the same leaves I was picking before." He said, "I know. That is what I said." She walked back up through the garden toward the village, and the morning was fully itself now, warm and clear and ordinary in the way that mornings are ordinary when something has shifted in the person moving through them. She thought about what the monk had said and about what her grandmother had said, and she thought about the moment in the upper row when the aim had fallen away and the tea had been simply tea and she had been simply there. And she thought that this was perhaps the most useful thing she had ever been taught, and that she had not been taught it by anyone, but by the garden, and by the forgetting, and by the coolness of the leaves against her fingertips at the moment when she stopped reaching through them towards something else. She picked tea every morning for the rest of her life. On most mornings she was reaching, which was the ordinary condition of a person with things to do and reasons for doing them. And she picked with competence and efficiency and the deep physical knowledge of 30 years. And the tea was good. But on some mornings, not many, maybe a dozen a year, something happened that had happened first on the morning of the 7th day of the 7th month, when the aim fell away, and there was only the garden and the hands and the leaves in the early light. And on those mornings, the picking was like being picked, like being the one received rather than the one receiving. And the basket at the end of those mornings felt different in the arm, not lighter or heavier, but more honestly weighted, the weight of something that knows what it is. She told her daughter about this eventually, when the daughter was old enough to work the upper rows alone. She did not tell her about the ceremony or the venerable Min or the morning on the hillside. She simply said, "Some mornings the garden tells you something. When it does, stop and listen. You can continue after." Her daughter, who had her mother's hands, said, "What does it say?" Lin said, "It says the same thing each time. I only know it when I hear it." You have been in the garden too, in your own way, moving through the rows of the day with your hands doing what your hands know how to do, reaching for what needs to be reached for, attending to what needs attending. Most of the day the aim is there, and the aim is necessary, and there is no shame in it. But here, now, the aim can rest. There is nothing to pick tonight. The basket is full, or it is not full, and it does not matter. Because the day of picking is done, and what was picked has been picked, and it will be what it will be. And the garden will be there in the morning. Let the hands rest in the lap, loosely, the way hands rest when they are not reaching for anything. Feel the specific weight of them, heavier than you expect when you stop lifting them toward something. The weight of hands that have worked today. Let whatever is beneath your hands hold that weight now. The breath comes in and finds the space that is waiting for it. The way the upper shoot of the tea bush finds the light, without deciding to find it, simply following what the shoot is made to follow. And then out. Easy. The way the dew lifts from the leaves when the warmth comes. Not pushed. Not hurried. Simply going because the conditions allow it. Something below the day's reaching is still. It was still while you were reaching. It did not require you to stop reaching in order to be what it is. It is simply the part of you that is not in the way of itself. Not trying to be the ceremony. Not trying to be different from what it is on a regular morning. You do not have to find this tonight. You only have to allow it to be what it already is. Let the eyes be wherever they have settled. Let the jaw go soft. Let the weight of the head go to wherever it wants to go, back or to the side, the way a branch bends toward the light without consulting anyone. The garden will be there tomorrow. Tonight there is only this, the end of the reaching, and the stillness underneath it, which has been here all along. Dew on the leaves before the sun comes, ordinary and perfect, and asking nothing at all. And further north, where the coast opens into the wide dark of the sea and the fishing boats are already out before the sky shows what it is going to be, an old man is sitting at the back of his boat with his nets in and the water around him doing what it does at this hour. And he has been sitting on this water every morning for 50 years. And tonight, for the first time, he is not thinking about the fish. The river at Moniwa was wide and dark in the hour before dawn, and Yukiya sat in the back of his boat with his nets coiled at his feet and the water moving beneath him in the way that wide rivers move at that hour, which is without urgency, without intention. Simply the long body of the water going where it has always gone. He was 58 years old, and he had been fishing this river since the age of 8, when his father first took him out before dawn and showed him how to read the surface of the water for the signs of what was below it, the small disturbances, the slight changes in color that indicated depth and current, and the presence of fish in numbers worth netting. He had learned to read the river the way other men learn to read text. Letter by letter at first, and then in whole words, and then in meaning, without having to parse the meaning, the eye going straight to what mattered. He knew this river so well that he sometimes thought of it as something he lived inside rather than something he moved across. He knew the deep channel that ran along the eastern bank in the dry season, and the way it shifted westward when the rains came and the river swelled. He knew the places where the bottom was mud and the places where it was sand, and the one place, 3 bends south of the temple, where an old teak log had fallen into the river perhaps 40 years ago and had never washed away, and around which certain fish congregated in the early morning hours as though the log were a meeting place that had been on their calendars since the beginning. He was not thinking about the fish this morning. This was unusual. In 50 years of fishing, Yukiya had rarely gone out on the river without thinking about the fish. The fish were the reason for the river, in the practical sense that the river was the means by which Kyo fed his family and paid for his son's schooling and contributed to the village fund for the temple's maintenance, and had, over 50 years, he accumulated the small savings that meant he could stop fishing when his back finally told him to stop. The fish mattered. They mattered concretely, in the way that things matter when your life depends on them. But this morning he had come to the river in the dark and settled into the back of the boat and pushed off from the bank and let the current take him to the first net position. All of this by feel and long habit. And when he arrived at the position and should have begun the process of setting the net and watching the water for the signs, he had simply sat. The thing that had brought him to this sitting without intention was a conversation he had had 3 days earlier with a monk from the forest monastery near Ledi. He knew things about this river that he had never been able to say to anyone, not because they were private, but because they existed in a form that language could not quite hold. He knew, for instance, that the river smelled different at different depths, or rather that the water you brought up in a net from the deeper channel smelled different from the water at the surface, cooler and with something in it that was like the smell of time. The smell of water that had been moving a very long time without stopping. He knew that the current on the surface of the river and the current at the bottom were not the same current, that the surface moved with the wind and the recent rain, while below, the river moved to its own rhythm, slower and more consistent, unaffected by the weather above it. He had never thought of this as significant. It was simply a fact about the river, the way it was a fact that certain fish preferred the deeper water and others the shallows. But sitting in the boat, in the dark, 3 days after Ashin Thila's words had come to rest in him, the fact about the river's 2 currents was no longer only a fact. It was a description of something he had been feeling in his own body for 3 nights without having the shape for it. The monk's name was Ashin Thila, a young man of perhaps 25, who had been at the forest monastery for 2 years, and who sometimes came to the village in the afternoons to sit with the lay people who gathered under the banyan tree near the well to hear whoever wanted to speak about the Dhamma. Yukiya had been to these gatherings perhaps a dozen times over the years, not with great seriousness. but the way a man goes to a place where something interesting is sometimes said. In case today is a day when something interesting is said. 3 days ago, something interesting had been said. Ashin Tila had been talking about the breath, not in the complicated way that monks sometimes talked about practice, with terminology that required other terminology to understand it. He had been talking about it the way a person talks about something they have recently discovered is simpler than they thought. He said the breath goes in and comes out. It has been doing this since the first moment of your life. You have never had to manage it. You have never had to remember it or intend it. It simply does what it does. Without you. He had paused and looked at the people sitting under the banyan tree and said, "Has there been a single moment in your life when the breath required your help?" The people under the banyan tree had been quiet. Kaya had been quiet. He had been thinking about the breath, which he did not usually think about, and discovering, as Ashin Tila had seemed to expect, he would discover that the answer was no. The breath had never required his help. It had been managing itself for 58 years without consulting him. Ashin Tila had said so. There is something in you that has been taking care of you since before you could take care of anything. Something that does not need you to manage it. Something that has been doing what it does. Through every morning you went out on the river and every night you came back. Through the good seasons and the poor ones. Through the grief and the ordinary happiness. Through every moment you were thinking about something else. He had not said more than this. He had let it sit there under the banyan tree, the way you let a net sit in the water, not pulling it, giving it time to find what it would find. Yukiya had gone home and eaten his evening meal, and lain down beside his wife and found, for the first time in a long time, that he did not fall asleep immediately upon lying down. He had lain in the dark and thought about the breath. He had paid attention to it in the way Ashin Tila seemed to be suggesting, which was not to control it or slow it or do anything to it, but simply to notice it, the way you notice the river when you are on it, as a presence rather than a problem. He had noticed that the breath, when you actually paid attention to it, was deeper and slower than the breath you were usually aware of. There was a breath at the surface, the breath of the chest and the effort of the day, quick and functional. And there was a breath below that, a breath that moved differently, that came from somewhere further down in the body, that was not in a hurry, that had, Kaya thought, in the 3 nights since he heard Ashin Tila speak, the quality of something that had never been in a hurry. He had been thinking about this for 3 days, and now he was on the river in the dark, and the fish were wherever fish were at this hour, and he had not set his net, and he was not sure he was going to. The sky to the east above the far bank was doing what it did before sunrise, which was to decide what color it was going to be. The water around the boat was dark but not opaque. There was a faint reflective quality to it. The way still water holds light, it has not been given. A bird called from somewhere in the palms on the bank, once, and then did not call again. Yukiya put his hands on his knees and felt the boat move slightly under him with the current. A small motion, a rocking so gentle, it was more like the suggestion of a rocking, and he breathed in the way he had been practicing, lower than usual, slower than his chest wanted to go, and he felt the familiar sensation of the past 3 nights, which was that, below the breath he was breathing, there was another breath. Or not a breath, but a quality that was like what breath would be if breath were not an action but a condition. Not something the body did, but something the body was. The net was still at his feet. He did not pull it and he did not release it. He simply sat in the boat with his hands on his knees and let the river do what the river did at this hour, which was to carry him slowly south without asking him to go anywhere. And the sky above him decided it was going to be pale gold and then decided to become that. And somewhere behind him, upriver, the monastery bell at Ledi was beginning its morning sequence. 4 strikes. A pause. 4 strikes. A pause. The sound coming across the water, the way sound travels across wide water, without losing its shape, arriving clearly, even from a distance. He sat with the bell and the water and the breath below the breath, and he understood, not with words, that this was also fishing, that what he was doing on this river, on this morning, was not different from what he had been doing for 50 years, which was to be in the presence of something large and moving and largely invisible, and to wait, with attention, for what it would offer. The fish were in the river. The fish had always been in the river. He knew where they were, in the way that 50 years of reading a river gives you knowledge of what is below the surface. Knowledge that does not require the eye, but lives in the body. The same place where the lower breath lived. He picked up the net. He set it in the place he knew to set it. The place 3 bends from the temple, where the old teak log lay on the bottom, where the fish came in the early morning, because the current eddied there, and the water was slightly warmer than elsewhere, and the log had made a home that fish return to the way living things return to what is familiar and sustaining. The net went into the water, and he waited, and the morning came fully. And when he pulled the net in, it was heavier than he had expected. And he sat in the brightening morning with the weight of the net in his hands, and felt something he could not have named. A quality of the morning that was both ordinary and not ordinary. The way the breath below the breath was both inside him and somehow larger than him. Both his and not his. Both effort and the absence of effort. He rowed back to the bank in the growing light. The catch in the basket at his feet, and the monastery bell had stopped, and the birds were beginning in the palms, and the village was waking on the bank above him. The first smoke rising from the cook fires, the first sounds of the morning's work. He tied the boat and sat for a moment before climbing the bank. He said nothing. There was no one to say anything to. But something had happened on the water this morning that had not happened before, or that had always been happening and that he had not noticed before, which amounts to the same thing and does not amount to the same thing, and he was not yet sure which it was. He went to find Ashintila that afternoon, after the fish had been sold and the net had been washed and dried and the boat had been tied securely for the night. He found the monk sitting under the banyan tree alone, reading, and he sat down nearby and waited until the monk looked up. He said, "I did not set the net for a long time this morning." Ashintila said, "And did you catch fish?" Ukaya said more than usual. The monk was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What were you doing while you were not setting the net?" Ukaya said, "I was breathing, in the way you described." Ashintila said, "And what did you find?" Ukaya looked at the river visible between the trees at the edge of the village. He said, "I found that the river was doing what the river always does, and I was part of it rather than on top of it." The monk said nothing for a while. Then he said, "That is exactly it." Ukaya said, "What is exactly it?" Ashintila said, "What you just described. That is the whole thing." Ukaya fished the river for 11 more years, until the season his back finally told him to stop. He still went to the river after that, in the early mornings, not to fish, but to sit in the boat in the dark and let the current take him south and then row back, which was a thing his wife accepted without comment, because she had been married to a man who went to the river every morning for 60 years and had no expectation that this would change. He went to the gatherings under the banyan tree when Ashinthila spoke, and when Ashinthila left the forest monastery for a larger one further east, Yu Kyo continued to go, and sometimes there was a monk, and sometimes there was not, and on the mornings when there was not, he would sit under the tree alone for a while, which the village had come to accept as his way, the way they had come to accept many things about him, the quietness that had increased as he aged, the way he received difficult news without visible reaction, the way he sat beside a dying neighbor with the quality of presence that had nothing to do with words. His son asked him once, in the year before Yu Kaya's death, whether he was afraid of dying. Yu Kya thought about this for a while. Then he said, I am sitting in the boat. The river is doing what the river does. His son said, I do not understand what that means. Yu Kya said, I know. You will. He died on a morning in the dry season, when the river was low and clear and ran quickly over the exposed rocks at the bend near the temple. His wife said that his face, when she found him, was the face of someone who had set the net and was waiting, with attention, for what the water would offer. She did not say this as a comfort. She said it because it was the most accurate description she had. The breath is doing what the breath always does. Not the breath you are managing. Not the breath you are using to get through the day. The breath below that. The one that has been moving in you since before you knew there was a you that things moved in. That breath has not changed. It has not been tired by the day. It has not been carrying what you have been carrying. It has simply been doing what it does, low and steady, and entirely without need of your assistance. Feel it now, without doing anything to it. Let the chest be easy. Let the belly be soft. Let the breath come from somewhere lower than the chest wants it to come from the place where the river runs wide and deep before it reaches the shallows, where the current is slow and the movement is all below the surface. In and then out. Not pushed, not hurried. Simply going because the conditions allow it. Because the body opens and the air comes in, and the body closes and the air goes out. And this has been happening for as long as you have been alive, and will happen until you are not. And you have never had to manage it even once. Something in you has been taking care of you tonight, and all day, and for your entire life. Not the managing part. Not the part that worries and plans and carries the unresolved thing. The part below that. The still water below the surface water. The breath below the breath. The thing that does what it does without being asked and without stopping. Let the rest of it rest now. The body is heavy. Let it be heavy. The heaviness is the body telling you it is ready to put down what it has been carrying, that it has been waiting all day for this permission. You can give it. Let the legs go. Let the arms go. Let the hands open. Palm up, the way a net opens in the water, no longer holding, no longer seeking, simply present to whatever the current brings. The thoughts that are still moving will continue for a while. Let them move. They are the surface of the river, doing what surfaces do. Below them, the water is already still, the deep current already going where it goes, quiet and dark and entirely sufficient. You are in the boat. The river is doing what the river does. There is nothing more required of you tonight. Only this to be part of it rather than on top of it. And the river will carry you where you are going as it has always carried you, without fail, without exception. Through every morning you woke, and every night you did not know you were drifting toward rest. Let the eyes close if they have not already. Let the last sound you are aware of be the sound of the water, which is always there, which you could always hear if the surface were quiet enough to hear through. It is quiet enough now. There is no new story tonight. There is only the water. You have traveled a long way to get here, through 8 lives in 8 corners of the world, through the weaving quarter of an ancient city on an island in the Indian Ocean, through a valley in China where a farmer walked the same path for 40 years and one morning stopped in the middle of it and saw what he had been carrying. You have been to the high villages of Tibet and the cedar-shadowed monastery in the mountains of Japan, to the hillside in Korea where a kiln burned for 3 days and a man sat with his back against the warm stone and waited. You have been to a tea garden in Vietnam in the hour before the dew lifts, and to a wide dark river in Burma where a fisherman sat in a boat and did not set his net and caught more fish than usual. All of them found the same thing, not the same words for it, not the same tradition or the same practice or the same century. Nandini found it in the sound the shuttle makes when the hands have finally stopped telling the shuttle what to do. Wenbohai found it at the bottom of a bucket he had been carrying for 40 years. Dawa found it below the surface, sound of a river that had been speaking to her for 2 years before she heard it. Ryokan found it in a pot of burned rice. Jae-won found it in a bowl that came out of the kiln different from the bowl he had been trying to make. Lin found it in a tea garden when she forgot she was picking for a ceremony. Yukaya found it on a dark river when he sat in the boat and breathed in the way he had been practicing, and felt below his ordinary breath, the breath that had been there all along. The same thing, every time. Below the surface, something that does not move. You know what this is. You have felt it at least once, probably more than once, probably in the middle of some entirely ordinary task, in the middle of washing something or walking somewhere familiar, or simply sitting in a quiet room when the noise of the day had finally settled enough to let you hear below it. A moment when you were not performing, being yourself and not managing anything and not carrying the weight of what you had been carrying. And in that moment, something that was underneath all the rest of it simply was there, present and still and so much more familiar than you expected. That is where you are going tonight. Not somewhere you have never been. Somewhere you have been before, that you simply cannot always find from the surface. The surface is quieter now than it was this morning. The day's movement is settling the way the water in Wenbohai's bucket settled when he stopped walking. The small waves crossing and recrossing and becoming smaller. The surface finding its way toward what was always underneath it. Let the breath be slow. Let the body be exactly as heavy as it is, which is heavier than you have been allowing it to be all day, because you have been holding it upright and keeping it available and asking it to perform the basic maintenance of being a person in the world. And now you do not need it to do any of that. The chair or the bed or the floor is doing the holding now. It has been trying to do the holding all day. Let it. Think of what it took each of them to arrive at the place below. Nandini did not decide to find peace. She sat down at the loom because it was morning, and the loom was there, and the cloth needed making. And peace arrived because she was fully in the making, and the making had no room for anything else. She did not even know she had found it until it was already there. The stone in her chest quiet, her hands moving, the shuttle going back and forth the way it always went. Wenbohai walked the same path for 40 years before he looked into the bucket. Not 40 years of trying to look, 40 years of walking, which is not the same thing, and is perhaps the necessary thing. The 40 years that prepared his eyes to finally see what the bucket had been showing him every morning. Dawa knelt at the river for 2 years in grief before she heard the sound below the surface sound. She did not push the grief away. She knelt in it and washed the cloth and let the river be the river and the grief be the grief. And one morning the river said what it had been saying the entire time, which was not that the grief was wrong, but that the grief was on the surface, which is where grief lives. And below the surface, unchanged and unchanging, was the depth. Ryokan burned the rice. That was the thing that broke the trying, that forced the return. You cannot cook rice and think about what someone will think of the cooking. Not for long. Not without the rice telling you which one you are actually doing. The rice was the teacher. The fire was the teacher. The present moment in the kitchen at 4 in the morning was the teacher. And what it taught was, you left. Come back. Jaewon waited 3 years and made the bowl 14 times and failed each time the same way, by knowing too clearly what he wanted the bowl to be. It was only when he was too tired to know anything that the bowl could know what it was. The tiredness was not the enemy of the practice. The tiredness was the practice removing the obstacle. Lin forgot. That is all she did. She forgot she was picking for the ceremony, and she was simply in the garden, her hands doing what her hands knew how to do, and the garden became itself, and the leaves became themselves, and she became herself, not a person with an aim, but a person in the place she was, and the place was enough, and the leaves in her hands were the ceremony. Yukiya sat in the boat and breathed. That was all. He breathed in the way the young monk had described, lower than usual, slower than the chest wanted to go, down to the place where the breath had always been going, the place below the breath you are aware of, below the breath of effort and management and the carrying of the day. He breathed his way to the bottom, and at the bottom the fish were there, and the river was there, and he was there, and there was no distance between any of these things. Not one of them arrived at the still place by pursuing it. They arrived by being sufficiently present to what was in front of them that the pursuit fell away. The loom, the bucket, the river, the kitchen, the kiln, the tea garden, the dark water of a wide river at 4 in the morning. These were not spiritual exercises. These were the places where their lives were. And in their lives, on ordinary mornings, doing ordinary work, the still place was available, because the still place is always available. Because it is not somewhere else. It is where you already are, below whatever you happen to be doing. This is the thing tonight was trying to say. Not that you need to become something different. Not that you need to practice something or understand something or find the right words for something. Only that, below the surface of whatever you are, right now, in this room, in this body, in this quiet, there is something that has not moved through any of today and will not move through whatever tomorrow brings. It is the water at the bottom of the bucket. It is the depth of the river below the current. It is the sound below the surface sound that Dawa heard one morning at the edge of a river in Tibet and could not unhear after that, because you cannot unknow a thing you have genuinely heard, and now you have heard it too, carried here through 7 lives across 12 centuries, and it is yours the same way it was always theirs, which is to say, it was never theirs either. It was always simply there, available, waiting without impatience for whoever was ready to stop walking long enough to look down and see it. Nandini sat down at her loom every morning for 31 years, and the shuttle moved through the warp, and the cloth appeared 1 line at a time, and somewhere in the doing of that, the weight she had been carrying became quiet. not because it had been resolved, but because the work had asked for all of her, and there was no part of her left over to stand outside it and worry. She is not weaving now, but the quietness is available. It was never the weaving that made it available. The weaving was only the door she happened to know how to open. Your door is different. You have been opening it your whole life. In the moments when you were fully in the thing in front of you, and the thing in front of you was the whole of what was happening, and the weight floated briefly to the surface and stayed there, harmless, while everything below it went about its quiet work. That is all any of them did. They did the thing in front of them with the whole of themselves, and the surface moved, and below the surface something continued that had never been interrupted. The flame of the lamp in Nandini's kitchen, in the hour before the morning bells, the mist around Wen Bohai's knees, on the path through the lower field, Dawa's hands in cold water, the mountain above her filling half the sky, the river saying what rivers say, the pine smoke in Ryokan's kitchen before anyone else was awake, and the sound of fire establishing itself in the hearth, the kiln cooling in the evening above the Korean valley, and the bowl inside it becoming what it was going to become, the dew on the upper leaves of the tea garden, and Lin's hands receiving what was ready to be received, the wide dark river and the boat and the nets coiled at the feet of a man who had finally, after 50 years, stopped being only on top of the water. All of it was the same water. All of it was the same stillness below the moving. The water in the lake tonight is doing what it does. The surface is moving, or it is still, and either way the depth is doing what the depth always does, which is to be the depth, to be what is below the sloshing and the breaking of the light into smaller lights, to be what was there before the wind came and will be there after the wind goes. That depth is in you. It has always been in you. It does not become available through effort or through understanding or through the right practice or the correct number of years of working at it. It is simply there, the way the floor of the lake is there, unvisited and unchanging, and holding everything above it without being asked. You have been on the surface all day. You are allowed to go deeper now, not by doing anything, not by trying, by the same means that Jaewon's bowl became what it was, which was by stopping trying and allowing the temperature and the time to do what temperature and time do when you stop standing in the way of them. The breath goes in, lower than the chest, lower than the effort of the day, into the place where the breath has always known to go when no one is managing it, and then out, the whole length of it, slow, the way the water finds its way to the lowest available place, without hurrying, without second-guessing the path, and then in again. You do not need to count the breaths. You do not need to do anything with them except allow them to be what they are, which is the oldest, most faithful thing your body knows how to do, the thing it has been doing since the very first moment, the thing it will do until the very last, without ever once asking for your help. Let the jaw release. You have been holding it since morning, perhaps since longer than morning, perhaps since a time you cannot remember when you first learned to hold things in the jaw, in the shoulders, in the space behind the eyes, and the holding became so familiar that you stopped knowing it was happening. It does not have to happen now. The shoulders, if they are up, can come down, not all the way, maybe, but further than they are. The hands, if they are closed, can open, palm up. The way Ryokan's hands looked after the last pot was washed and the fire was banked, open and warm and finished. Something is already happening, that has nothing to do with your effort. The body knows how to do this. It has been doing it every night of your life. The slow migration from the surface toward the depth, the way the water stills from the bottom up when the wind goes down. The deepest places, finding their stillness first and the surface following, gradually, in its own time. You are somewhere in that process now. Let it continue. The sound of the loom, if you can still hear it, is only in the memory now. The path through the mist, the spring at the base of the hill, the flat rock by the river, the kitchen before anyone was awake, the kiln in the Korean valley, the tea garden before sunrise, the wide dark river and the boat barely moving in the current. All of it is the same place. The place below. The place where the water does not move, no matter what the surface is doing. You have been there before. You have been there in the mornings when you woke up and lay for a moment in the space between sleep and waking and knew, for a few seconds before the day assembled itself, that you were simply here, simply present, not needing anything, not carrying anything, not going anywhere. That space is real. It is not a trick of the half-awake mind. It is where you actually live, below the surface of everything you carry. And you are going back there now, not by trying to get there. You cannot try your way to the bottom of a lake. You can only stop moving and let the water carry you down, which it will do, which it always does. Because down is where the body wants to go when you stop asking it to stay up. The breath is lower now than it was when you first lay down or sat back or settled into wherever you have settled. It has found its depth without you managing it. In a little while, it will find a depth you are not aware of, because you will be asleep. That is all sleep is. The breath finding the depth below the depth you can follow. The body doing what the body does when you have finally stopped asking it to perform anything. Let the last thought go, not by pushing it away. By the same means, Lin let the ceremony fall away, which was not by deciding to let it go, but by going so deeply into the work that the aim ran out of room to stand. The aim is running out of room. The room is very quiet now. Whatever sounds you can still hear, let them be water. Let them be the river that has been running all night beneath this conversation, that was running before you came to it, and will be running long after, patient and dark, and entirely at home in its own depth. You are part of it now, not on top of it. The depth is holding you the way it has always held you, the way the floor of the lake holds everything above it, simply by being what it is. Be what you are, here, in the quiet. The water knows the way. The lake is still tonight, not because the wind has stopped. The surface does what the surface does, moving and breaking and moving again. The surface has never needed to be still, for the depth to be still. That was what tonight kept trying to say. Across 12 centuries and 7 lives, through the loom and the bucket and the river in Tibet and the kitchen fire and the kiln and the tea garden and the boat on the dark water, the depth was always still. You have been to Sri Lanka tonight, and to a valley in China, and to the high mountains of Tibet and the cedar-shadowed monastery in Japan, and to a hillside in Korea, and a tea garden in Vietnam, and a wide river in Burma. You have sat with 7 people who found something below the surface of an ordinary morning, not by looking for it or practicing toward it, but by being so fully in the work in front of them that the surface stopped being the only thing, and the depth became briefly, quietly visible. It is visible now. I want to say something honest before this night is over. I do not know if I have found this the way these 7 people found it. I have felt the edge of it. In the mornings before the day assembles itself. On evenings, when the light does something particular in whatever room I am in. I come to these stories because I am looking for it. I think that is reason enough to come. What shifted in you tonight belongs to you. Whatever became briefly quieter in the chest, whatever small loosening happened somewhere in the body while you were not managing it, you do not have to hold on to it. It does not need to be held. It is where you already live, below everything the surface is doing. Tomorrow will have its movement. That is what days are. And below all of it, this will still be here. If this night was useful to you, come back. There will be more lives from far corners of the world that touch this same depth from a different direction. And together they will find what everyone who has ever gone still enough has found, which is that there is only one depth, and it belongs to everyone, and it was never somewhere else. Sleep well. You are already in the deep water. You have always been.